Well, my work is really on the history of American education with a special focus on the history of African American education. And my work in the area that is in history of education, I think was shaped by my earlier major, which was in curriculum and instruction. I started out in the College of Education in curriculum and instruction and was in that program for 2 years, and that involved teacher certification. I did practice teaching on the west side of Chicago at Marshall High School. And when I came back and began to start a different career in the PhD program in the history of education, I've always been interested in history as a dialogue between the past and the present. I know there's a part of me where I can write history just for the professional historians. But when I think about my work, I'm thinking always about the kind of history of education that I would deliver to prospective teachers, that I would deliver to superintendents and to principals. What is it about the dialogue between the past and the present that informs their orientation, that informs their thinking and the ways in which they go about not only the practice of education or managing educational systems, but even in terms of their consciousness of the past as it relates to the present. Now, my work started out roughly in the post-Civil War period to post-Depression, uh, roughly 1860s to the 1930s. And that, of course, being involved in the field, it actually did lead me to um, history of education work that was more related to policy by way of court cases. Beginning in the early 1980s, I was called to be expert witness in the St. Louis desegregation case. And one of the questions in the case was, whether the system of public education in St. Louis in the early 1980s were in any way continuing effects of past discrimination. Was there any of the pre-Brown institutions, pre-Brown ways of educating, pre-Brown ways of racial segregation that continued in the 1980s? And so I had to go and do a history of education of St. Louis that looked at those questions and brought them all the way up to the present. Well, the St. Louis case led me also to the Kansas City deseg case, which was interestingly a different case because the history of education in St. Louis was just about that city. But in the Kansas City case, it was a metropolitan deseg case that involved Kansas City and 17 surrounding suburban school districts. And one of the questions was whether it was a metropolitan plan and whether the independent districts that were not a part of Kansas City public school system could also be held accountable for the kinds of segregation that occurred in Kansas City. Well, in my view, it could. Eventually, the judge separated those districts from the case. But I discovered that because there was only one high school, which was Lincoln High School in Kansas City, all of the other districts sent their African American students into the city, which eventually caused an intensification of segregation in the city because parents literally moved into the city to be closer to the school. And so it not only intensified segregation within the school, it also intensified segregation in the neighborhood. And the whole metropolitan area was responsible for what happened within the city. So there are a lot of things that happened. Actually, I was in the process of writing the book at the time that I was in the Kansas City deseg case, which ended up being the history of black education in the South, 1860 to 1935. At the time, I didn't have a single chart or a single graph or a single thing in the book. But as an expert witness, I remember the judge said to me that he'd never had a historian as an expert witness, and he didn't know what to make of the work that we do. He said that he'd read history books, and it seemed to him to be one person's opinion against another person's opinion. And my view, as I said to him, I said, I've read law books, but I have the good sense not to practice law. To remind him that we do have a field of expertise that to the lay reader looks like one person's opinion to others. And during the course of the case, at one point, I was testifying about the African American families that lived in the independent school districts in Independence, Missouri, and places like that, that migrated into Kansas City. And I was trying to point out that the migration was not like the migration from the South, in which people were simply in search of better economic opportunities. But in fact, that many of the people in those areas had land and were landowners. But since there were no schools for their kids to go to, they sold that land and moved into the city. And the judge stopped me and says, how do you know the size of the land holdings they had in 1890 or 1910 or 1930. And I just looked at him and said, a plat book, Your Honor, a plat book. And it really hit him that historians actually do work based on evidence, much like people in other fields. And I think that's, from that point on, we had a very good relationship because he knew it wasn't my opinion, that I was looking at hard evidence to determine that sort of thing. I think the great thing about it in terms of my own work in the publication of the book, I realized that you write into an audience where they don't really understand this in the way that you do, and you need some fairly concrete and visible examples of what you're talking about. So I started to change and put in tables and charts and graphs, in part because that's what the judge could understand. And to me, he represented a kind of audience that would almost view my work as an opinion in the absence of that kind of data. So I just loaded it up with that kind of data, which actually improved the book a lot, and I think had much to do with the way in which it was received by the larger Academy of Professional Historians.